Sharper Than a Serpent's Tooth. Written by the Hanged Man 317 and read by Purple Star. Chapter 50. I Won't Be Used. Sneaking out was simple, but she'd already known that would be the case. It was getting back in that would prove difficult. One thing at a time. The window alarms were laughably easy to bypass. Simple magnetic sensors that she promptly disabled with one of the less powerful magnets in her lockpicking set. After that was the lock, which of course was meant to be operated from the inside, so that proved no obstacle. It seemed like the fates had aligned, and Aizawa had decided to end his patrol early, so he and Hitoshi could get some sleep before training tomorrow. Well, she supposed the intention was that all of them would sleep, but he really should have known better than to expect that. The true consequence of that decision was that she didn't have to worry about them coming home before expected and finding an empty apartment. Her lucky streak extended even further when Hitoshi actually went to sleep at a reasonable hour. Around midnight, she thought, although it was difficult to tell exactly when his breaths became more even. Soft snores drifting from the other side of the shared bedroom, as Era stared up at the ceiling and tapped the minutes against the mattress. The only unfortunate happening was the location of their apartment, 5th floor, and the fire escape was not outside of their bedroom. In the grand scheme of things, that was barely an obstacle. More of a nuisance than anything else. As Era stealthily opened the window, she poked her head out to map a path up to the roof, and deftly made good on that plan, shutting the window behind her. Right. Step 1 had gone off without a hitch, which could only mean there was some grand catastrophe lurking in the future. Best not to dwell on it. Era tugged at the hood of her sparrow cloak, running her fingers along the mask to ensure that it had stayed in place, before taking off across the rooftops towards her meeting place with Stain. She'd followed his advice and decided to leave her official UA hero costume behind in favor of her more low-key vigilante gear, with a few additions, courtesy of the support department. Transferring her gear to the new costume hadn't been particularly difficult. Most of it was attached to her belt, while the rest could fit in the pockets and loops she'd already fashioned her sparrow outfit with for this express purpose. The only thing of substance she'd had to leave behind was the full skull mask and the filtration systems within, which, it wasn't ideal, but she could do without. The rooftop was empty when she arrived, save the glimmer of streetlights caught within the rusted ductwork. There was no moon. It was nearing half full, she knew, but she'd been snared by thick gray clouds that swallowed up all but the faintest sliver of starlight. The rooftop was empty, but Era knew better than to assume for even a second that she was safe. Her ears caught the faintest scuff of feet against the concrete, and she whirled around to face her attacker, bringing her knife up to intercept his strike with a deafening clang. Past their crossed blades, she saw Stain grin.
Good reflexes.
Scowling, Era purposely scraped her knife across his katana, before dancing backwards a few steps. I thought we were past the whole trying to kill me thing.
If you had died from that, it would simply have proved that you are not worth my time.
Stain sheathed his sword and glanced up at the sky, eyes narrowing.
We have to go soon. There is work to be done. Ask your questions now.
How? Era hesitated, knife hand wavering before she tucked it away as well. How do you know I have questions? Stain scoffed, returning his cool gaze to her.
They always have questions. Doubts will only be a hindrance, so purge them before we begin. Ask.
Fine, said Era with a sigh. Why do you think All Might is the best hero?
He is the pinnacle of heroism. He does not work for money or fame or power. He simply upholds the greatest ideals of our society.
But he still makes money. And he's the most famous and powerful hero of our generation. Era chose her words very carefully, making sure to keep a hand wrapped around the hilt of a dagger. Stain just grinned, seemingly unperturbed.
A common misconception. But consider this. Should the hero ranking system not exist, would All Might be anything less than All Might? He is beyond the others in terms of heroism, and should he only care about ranking, he would not need to act so selflessly, so tirelessly. All Might does not just do the bare minimum. He does all that he can, whenever he can.
And the money?
Inconsequential. His wealth is just another attempt at corruption by the society. Without it, All Might would still be a hero.
But, he doesn't need to take the money.
Yes, he does.
He snapped, and Era tensed, only relaxing when Stain continued more calmly.
He does. Or else the masses would not accept him. Without the fetters of this broken system holding him down, All Might would be the pinnacle of heroism. His virtue cannot be measured by wealth. But still, our society is unable to recognize a true hero unless he is wealthy.
That made some sort of sense. All Might wouldn't have nearly as much respect or recognition without his fame, or his money. What about underground heroes?
What about them?
Well, they don't have fame. They're not in the ranking system, and they don't have merchandise or anything, so they don't make nearly as much money. Aren't they the ultimate examples of heroism, according to your standards?
And look where that gets them,
he sneered.
They die young and unknown, while celebrity heroes are showered with praise and licensing deals. All Might is worthy because he has surpassed all of these shallow frivolities. He represents something bigger than us all.
Slowly, Era nodded. She didn't feel that same creeping desperation that had seized her so suddenly during their previous meeting. Although whether that was a testament to the discussion, or the fact that she'd been poisoned, bleeding, and recovering from a harrowing near capture, Era did not know. And still it rang true. In its own way, Era wasn't completely sold on All Might being this grand, larger-than-life epitome of the heroic ideal, but that had never been a sticking point for her. Stain's criticisms of hero society as a whole were the true draw. An enticing explanation for all the things that just refused to make sense in her new world. No, All Might was never the problem. The killing. Stain tilted his head.
Yes, what about it?
You're not supposed to kill people for no reason. What makes murder the solution? Sighing, he rolled his eyes.
This again, Kato. Apologies, Sparrow. You of all people know that the most powerful messages are those scrawled in blood.
In a flash of metal and motion, Stain drew his blade, and Era stumbled to parry with the flat of her knife. She ducked below a second strike, rolling past him before springing to her feet once more. What the fuck? Another rippling arc of Stain's katana cut Era off. Clang! As it struck against her knife once more, sending jolts and tremors up her arms that had her gritting her teeth. Her eyes caught the way his offhand peeled away from the katana and reached for a dagger at his waist, and she pushed him away with a grunt, knocking aside the knife when he threw it. And then he stilled. The tip of his blade still twitched with restless energy, and Era watched him with a renewed wariness that made itself known in the tension of her shoulders, in the way her fingers curled around the hilt of her knife. What the fuck, Era wheezed, was that? Stain didn't seem to even acknowledge her question, instead eyeing her with an unsettling intensity.
Our society is a battleground, Sparrow. It is a place of constant strife, where those with power step over those without. Strength only respects strength. It is a disease, a sickness that cannot be cured, but only be purged.
Like gangrene. Poison in the blood. Need to cut off the limb. He nodded, pleased.
Yes.
And then he struck once more, Era barely able to dodge his katana, the blade dragging a sharp red line across her arm before she parried the smaller sword that had somehow found its way into his offhand. She drew out a second knife, putting up a desperate defense that showered the shadowed rooftops with white-hot sparks wherever their blades met. Stain stopped, just as suddenly as he had begun, leaving Era off balance and breathless, teetering on the edge of a true fight. He regarded her carefully.
Yes, like gangrene. There is no peaceful solution. The rotten flesh must be carved away, or else the body will succumb to its sickness.
But what if you accidentally cut off something that isn't rotten? What if you kill an innocent? Stain scoffed.
Oh, that is unlikely. I kill false heroes, Sparrow. They are all complicit, except for All Might.
So a true hero still protects the innocent.
That is the true hero's purpose.
But what if he's... Era hesitated, carefully watching him for even the slightest twitch of his hand. What if the hero can't do that?
Then he is not a hero, but a fraud.
What if it's an impossible situation? Stain's eyes glittered behind his mask.
Such as...
Someone has 3 hostages. He's a gunman, right? And he has 3 hostages. You can't. He's got his finger on the trigger and you have to decide. He says he'll shoot 2 of them, but you can kill the one and he'll let the other 2 go. Era breathed. What does a hero do? What would you do? For a moment, she thought that Stain was lost in thought, but no. The slightest shift of his weight, and they clashed again, fiercer than before. Era found herself pushed off balance by his frenzied flurry of attacks, sparks arcing from her daggers in a constant whirl of parry, riposte, counter-riposte. Until at last, Stain bent the dance to his favor, sweeping his leg around her ankle and tugging her off her feet. the blade pressed against her throat with cool indifference. It did not care whose blood it spilled tonight. And then it was gone, and Era could breathe again in gasping shudders. Stain sheathed his sword with a click.
I would kill the gunman.
He walked towards the edge of the roof, leaving Era to lie there in a stunned heap.
The time for questions is over. Let us go. He beat me.
Stain had beaten her handily, and he had barely broken a sweat. Was she really that rusty? Or was he just that good? She had doubts. Of course she had doubts. But he was just so certain. And it lent him a clarity of mind that she couldn't dismiss so easily. It made him deadly. Era, she desperately wanted that certainty. In a box, in a box, in a box, over and over again, until she wasn't even sure which thoughts were hers, which were slipping through the cracks to scrabble against the inside of her skull. Stain was a beacon, a bastion of something. Stability that she could catch and cling to with bloodied nails. Everything was so straightforward for him.
I would kill the gunman.
Just like that. No hesitation. As if that was the only answer there could possibly be. Era didn't think about how it wasn't an answer to the question she'd asked. She only thought about the swiftness, the surety, the simplicity of it all. Thought about how she could bask in the warmth of the fire behind his eyes. And maybe, just maybe, she'd find some of that certainty too. Press it against the tattered corners of her mind in the hopes that it would finally fix her. So she followed.
That's all you're good for, little bird.
She followed. Stain raced across the rooftops like he already knew his destination. Blades glinting in the lights of the street lamps whenever they passed over a dim alleyway. Quick and quiet, he moved with the precision of a man who was certain his entire life had been leading up to this very moment. Era stepped where he stepped, jumped where he jumped, pulled herself up the same rusted fire escapes that he had clambered past just moments before. This felt right, she realized. Sticking to the shadows, beholden to nothing but the blood in her veins and the thrill of a task carried out with ruthless precision. This is what I was built for. They stopped, Stain pausing at the lip of a crumbled building, staring down into the alleyway below. Silently kneeling beside him, Era followed his gaze to see the faint movement of a figure, leaning against a wall, face periodically illuminated by the amber glow of a cigarette. Stain didn't speak. He didn't need to. Era was intimately familiar with the language of the hunt and the hunted. The flicker of the eyes and that telltale twitch of fingers against the crumbling concrete. She knew a mark when she saw it. Wasting no time, Stain leapt into the alleyway and drew his sword across the mark's arm, splattering blood on the brick walls. Era cautiously dropped down behind him, lingering a little ways back as Stain drew away and licked the flat of his blade. She was familiar with his quirk, but after so long, she couldn't help the spark of awe at how quickly the man's body seized, shuddered, fell. Closer, now that the danger had truly passed, and Era peered around Stain to look at their mark.
Who is he?
Her voice was quiet, and there was a waver to it that she found most distasteful.
Does it matter? He is a fraud. Just another fake hero to be purged.
The man gasped, wheezing against the asphalt. Wait, please, I don't...
Shut up.
Stain snarled, dragging his blade across the ground and reveling in the way it screeched and scraped.
Are you watching this, Sparrow? See how he whines, how he begs for his life.
Era stared, unable to tear her eyes away from the desperation in the hero's face.
You're going to kill him. I feel like he has a right to beg. Disgusting. Pathetic.
Stain drew closer, lifting his katana to slide it under the man's chin.
This man calls himself Zephyr. He calls himself a hero. But when it comes time to prove himself worthy of the title, do you know what he does? Please,
The blade pressed deeper, red pooling up around the edges.
Shut up! I won't tell you again. Do you know what he does, Sparrow?
Era shook her head, not trusting herself to speak. The hero, Zephyr, was staring at her. She couldn't look away.
You're hurting him right now. Do you want to hurt him more? Don't look away. He runs.
Stain sneered down at the hero, blade dropping lower, towards the hollow of his collarbone.
I've watched him, Sparrow. He leaves them to die. He doesn't care about saving lives. You are not worth saving.
And yet, she couldn't keep herself from staring at his eyes blown wide with terror, with that mortal fear she had inflicted so many times before. Couldn't look away as his lips moved to form soundless words.
Help! Please!
Era felt the phantom sensation of blood, hot and heavy, beating at her fingertips, spattered up her arms and onto her chest.
It won't wash out. The red, it won't...
She's cold and hungry, and everything aches in a way that's become all too familiar. And none of that makes sense, because she didn't do anything wrong this time. She'd been good. She'd pleased Sensei in training. She'd stayed quiet when Basilisk set her dislocated shoulder. She'd knelt when she was supposed to, scrubbed all emotion from her face, didn't cry out or beg when they hurt her. And they did hurt her. But she doesn't know why. And that was wrong. That was scary. They'd locked her in the room. She doesn't want to go back to the room. Dark, the shadows pressing in until she was choking on them. Hunger digging dull knives into her stomach as she shook and shuddered against the silence. She doesn't want to go back to the room. So she follows when they open the door. Trembles with the effort of keeping pace with their long strides on her short, starved legs. Her hands are so small compared to theirs, crooked fingers curling into fists at her side as she struggles to keep her breathing even. Ragged gasps would be too loud. She is not meant to be heard. She follows, but still, Nyx, Basilisk, Argus, Sensei, someone. She cannot remember. The faces blur and shift, and she falls from her mind because someone grabs her shoulder tight enough to bruise, steering her forward down the hallway. Time slips away, and then she is standing in front of a door. In her memory, it is cruel, stained with deep crimson rust near the bottom, stretching up, past sight until it is all she can see. But it is only a door. It opens, same as any other. She is pushed through. Again, like before, the room is vast and endless, edges creased by the delicate touch of the void, stretching out to the unknown. She is shoved, and she stumbles to her knees. She does not stand, because she has not been told to. She is good. She is good. She does not want to go back to the room. A hand rests against her head and lifts it up, until she can see what she's been brought here for. There is a man, limp, lifeless, but for the subtle rise and fall of his chest where he sits, chained to a cold metal chair. She feels sick, but she is not sure why. Basilisk, Nyx, Sensei, Vulcan, Argus, it doesn't matter. Someone walks up to the man, raises a hand and brings it hard across his cheek. The sharp crack of his flesh would have made her wince when she was younger, but now she knows better. She watches, because that's what she was told to do.
Do you know what this man has done, little bird?
So what? She said. The words were ragged, pulled from her chest as if by a rusted hook. Stain looked back at her over his shoulder, expression inscrutable.
So,
he said, as if explaining to a child.
He is a coward who dares to claim otherwise. He is a disease, and his sickness will infect society. Leave it rotten. He's a fake hero, Sparrow. Look at him.
Are you listening, bird? Toriko, look at him. Look at him.
She does. He is scared. She remembers being scared. But it is vague, pestering, like a fly buzzing around her head that she could swat away if she were fast enough. All she knows now is that she's being molded into something greater. That she should be thankful, is thankful, for the chance to be more than a useless, whimpering waste of space like this man in front of her. But what she knows most of all is that she doesn't want to go back to the room. She wonders if this man is also special, if he is also being changed, if that is why he's so scared. But no, he's simply a traitor, a coward, a symptom of corruption within their ranks. That is what she is told, though she's not sure what to do with the information until there is a knife in her hands.
Do it, Sparrow.
Stain was pressing something towards her. Era looked down to see one of his blades, sharp and clean, glinting in the dim light from beyond the alley.
End him. Prove that you're better than you were.
Her hand curled around the hilt instinctively, pulling away from him to look at the prone man, now trembling against the ground. He was crying, she thought. For a moment, Era wondered what that felt like. Reached up to trace a line down her cheek with the pad of her thumb. It might be nice, she decided. But that was for other people. People who could afford such weakness. She stepped towards the man, tried to ignore the way his body spasmed in an attempt to flinch away. He was scared of her.
Look at him, afraid of a child. End his miserable life, bird. That's an order.
Orders are meant to be followed, and she does not want to go back to the room. It's simple, she thinks. The body is so fragile, and she knows that a single cut is all it will take. She walks towards the man, feels her hand clench around the dagger as he twitches against the chains in a futile attempt to get away from her. Numbly, she realizes that this is the first time someone has been afraid of her, rather than the other way around. It feels nice, like she's in control for once in her life. When she rests the blade against his neck, she can feel the rush of blood through his veins, how his pulse flutters just beneath his skin. And God, but she could just revel in this moment for all eternity, because just one motion this way or that, and he would snap, like a thread cut brutally short. So great a thing, a life. So frail. Infinite possibility, all held in the palm of her hand, balanced at the edge of her blade. But no, she cannot forget who is in charge here. Her own thread is pulled taut. Barbed wire snared around her limbs, jerking her towards a destination she can't see. This fleeting moment of power is just an illusion, same as any other. It tastes bitter on her tongue. Still, she doesn't want to go back to the room, to the dark, to the shadows that press against her skull and swell in her chest and claw at her lungs until she fears she might suffocate. She begins to draw the knife across his neck, and then he begs. "Please," whispered the hero, eyes glassy as he stared up at her. "Please don't do this." "I have to." Her voice was hoarse, knife clutched so tightly in her hand that she feared it might bruise the flesh. "You don't understand. I have to do this. I have to be good." Orders were meant to be followed, and Stain had just given her an order. Stain was going to save her. He'd promised. He'd promised he was going to save her. So why did this all feel so familiar that it was giving her vertigo? Why did her mouth feel so dry? Why did sweat gather at the back of her neck? Why did she feel like she was going back to the room? "I don't want to go back to the room. Please." He sounded so lost, so desperate, sobbing against the dirty asphalt, and for the first time, Era wondered if he actually deserved this. If anyone deserved this. "I do. I deserve this."
No one else, though.
I deserve this.
No one else deserved to feel like this. To shake and shudder with the terror of stalked prey. To be bound and helpless as the knife hovers overhead. To bleed out alone in a dingy alleyway.
The knife rips through the flesh, and she feels it splatter warm and heavy across her hands, her arms, her face. It falls across her tongue in that brief moment before she remembers to close her mouth, and she almost gags. Almost. Because she is not weak. She doesn't need to go back to the room. She doesn't need to be fixed. Not for this. A hand falls on her shoulder, and Sensei, Nyx, Argus, Basilisk, Vulcan, her father, it's her. Why are you making me do this? You're supposed to be my father. He smiles at her. It is cold, but it means she will not go back to the room. Not tonight. It means she will sleep, dreamless. For that, she would rip the throats from 100 men. And she will, because that is what she's meant for.
No. Behind her, Stain stirred. And Era got the distinct impression of a predator coiling before the strike.
No.
Era breathed. No, I won't kill him. Never again, I promised.
This man does not deserve to live. He is a coward, a hero for the fame, the money, the power. He doesn't care about the people he's supposed to protect. He would rather risk the lives of others than his own. Does that sound like a hero to you?
No, but it doesn't sound like a death sentence either.
I was right about you.
Stain hissed.
You can't change what you are, Katori. Although at least before, you had the guts to do what was necessary. Now you're just a weak-willed child who thinks that pretending to be good will rid her of the blood on her hands.
It won't wash out. The red, it won't...
Maybe so, said Era, forcing the waver from her voice and turning to face him. But at least I'm not a fanatic who thinks he's in the right no matter how many lives he takes. What has he done, Stain? What has he actually done?
He ran.
So he's a coward. So he doesn't deserve to be a hero. Why does he need to die for that?
Why can't you see it?
A desperation tinged Stain's voice, and his eyes were edging towards manic.
This society, it's... Why can't you understand? You could have been great, Katori. You would have been a tool for the system's upheaval, for the return of true heroism. What better redemption?
I think he was so certain, so sure. And Era, she was just a thing, a tool, like he'd said. She was nothing without someone to wield her. And yet, I'm not going to kill him, Stain. And yet, if you want to get to him, you're going to have to go through me. And yet, only one person has to die tonight. Stain paused, considering her for a long moment, until his shoulders began to shake.
He's laughing,
Era realized.
A pity. But at least your last act might be one of redemption, risking your life to save another. You realize he'd never do the same for you, correct? He won't save you, Katori.
I'm not worth saving.
Era gritted her teeth into a smile. Then I guess I'll have to be a hero enough for both of us, won't I?
What a waste of potential. It's a shame Phoenix left such a foul mark upon you. Or I might have actually believed that little declaration. You're a murderer and a coward, Katori. You can't change that.
He struck, the hiss of his feet against the asphalt, her only warning, before his blade crashed against her own. Era kicked him away with a shout, hands curling around her throwing knives and flinging them towards him. Of course, he parried them easily, but at least that gave her enough time to unholster the pistol at her thigh. Before she could raise it, he was on her again, a whirlwind of steel that she could barely manage to twist away from, parrying a few strikes with the flat of her dagger and ducking beneath the rest. Era narrowed her eyes and rotated around him. She needed to keep him off balance, needed to take whatever advantage she could get and press. Stain grinned, and immediately Era realized her mistake. His eyes started towards the now defenseless hero, knives slithing from their sheaths. Shit! Era wasn't used to defending another person. Not like this.
I guess Stain was right about that, too. I'm really not cut out for this hero thing.
Still, Era rushed forward to intercept the blade, sliding between Stain and Zephyr just before the katana pierced his neck. Of course, it pierced her shoulder instead, which was certainly not ideal. Era clasped one of her hands around the blade to keep him from pulling it back, ignoring the sharp sting across her palm and using her own knife to guard her precious blood. If Stain got a hold of that, the fight was over. "Get up," hissed Era, not even looking over her shoulder at the hero. "Get up! Fucking do something!" Miraculously, his twitches turned to the stuttering movement of someone breaking free from Staines' quirk, although she doubted her words had anything to do with that. Good timing, however, as Stain wrenched his katana through her hand, ripping across the flesh and swiping his tongue over the bloodied blade in one smooth motion. Era froze. Her joints locked, her chest tightened, and she stumbled as she fell. The moment her cheek hit the asphalt, she felt a burst of wind beside her. She blinked, and Zephyr was gone.
Figures.
Really should have seen that one coming, honestly.
A blade entered her field of vision, and Era was struck with a distinct sense of déjà vu.
I warned you.
Stain sounded almost mournful as he brought the tip of his katana to her throat.
A coward through and through. Such a powerful quirk, and he uses it to flee.
Well, if I was that fast, I'd probably be running too.
I don't doubt that.
He hummed thoughtfully. And Era twitched her fingers in a desperate bid to break free.
What will your death mean, I wonder? What passage of history will be marked by your blood? Grand paragraphs? A statement that echoes far beyond your short lifespan, perhaps? Or just a footnote. An afterthought in the reckoning that is to come. Do you know, Katori?
Told you to call me Sparrow, she grunted, still flexing her limbs against his quirk. She could swear there was some give, that she could feel her nerves spark at the edge of her grasp.
Sparrow, Katori, what does it matter? You're an impetus of change. Did you know that? What you did, the ripples stretched far beyond your reach. And yet you yourself are nothing. Mindless murder. Blood without purpose. Who will miss you, Katori? Who will even know you're gone?
The names stuck in her throat, because right now she didn't deserve to say them. Would they miss me? Doubtless they would, for a time. But eventually they'd move on. She always did, didn't she? Even though it felt like a piece of her had been ripped from her chest, she'd always moved on. She was probably just a nuisance to them anyway. A burden. They should be glad to be rid of her. And yet... Hitoshi called her a friend. Did things for her with no expectation of anything in return. Joked and laughed and rested his head upon her shoulder. She would miss him. And Aizawa, he told her he was proud of her. He never hit her, never hurt her, never so much as raised his voice, even when she deserved it. I deserved it. He ruffled her hair and he helped her breathe when she was weak, and he tried to answer her questions, and he cared. So much. Both of them did. And she would miss them. Losing them would hurt more than any torture she'd ever experienced. She was sure that she wouldn't survive it, that she would finally shatter. Era felt a spasm in her foot, and then all at once, control came crashing down over her. She scrambled to her feet and shoved a knife into Staines' leg, ignoring his sharp curses as she turned to run away. White-hot pain across the back of her thigh. Era stumbled, fell. She hit the ground before her body locked up once more, securely under the effect of Staines' quirk.
On any other night, I'd want to know how you broke free so fast.
He hissed, and Era let herself be satisfied at how his voice was slightly creased with pain.
But tonight, I would rather just be rid of you. Goodbye, Katori.
Pain, choking, drowning. Darkness. She awoke to the coppery taste of blood and a terrible ache in her throat.
That's how he killed me then.
Reaching up to brush her hand across her neck, Era found flaking blood and a raised, jagged line of flesh. Pinpricks of pain skittering out from wherever her fingers touched. Okay, she needed to move. That was key. If she could move, then she could run. Her legs seemed functional enough, save a lingering shudder in her left thigh. Wriggling strands of muscle, knitting themselves together like so many worms. Right. Stain had practically hamstrung her. Wonderful. Era staggered to her feet, testing her weight and finding that the leg would hold. Every breath was knives against her tattered throat, and her mouth was thick with old blood. But other than that, she was functional. Which was good, because it quickly came to her attention
that she wasn't alone in the alley. She twisted to the side just as a bullet whizzed past, the sharp crack of a silenced pistol echoing off the closed walls. If Era could speak past a barbed wire in her throat, she probably would have cursed. As it was, all she could do was dart to the side once more as a second shot clipped her arm. She scrambled towards the fire escape, fingertips grazing against the bottom rung, before another bullet found her shoulder and the cool metal slipped from her grasp. Crumbling to the ground, Era quickly staggered to her feet to face her attackers. Nyx, Basilisk, a few others she didn't recognize. Not that it mattered. Nyx grinned past their smoking gun.
"Hey there, birdie. Have to say, thought you'd almost make it too easy for us with that whole possum shtick you had going there. Thanks for at least giving me some target practice."
Breathe.
Era's mind was still scrambled from her recent death, strands of shadow still clinging to her senses and dragging them back into the mire. All in all, it was a less than ideal situation. Brushing a hand across her belt, she found that Stain had been kind enough to leave her equipment behind. What a gentleman. After the last time she'd been attacked, Era had resolved that she would never be caught so helpless again, and so she'd made a few adjustments to her belt. The kind of adjustments that would no doubt make Aizawa lose his shit. But he wasn't here right now, was he? Nyx lined up the shot. Era wrapped her hands around the panic switch and tugged. Several things happened at once. Sense and sight and sound wrapped up in tangled threads of quickened time. The clatter of half a dozen grenades against the asphalt, the crack of Nyx's gun through the air, white-hot pain bursting across her side, the bunch of muscles beneath her legs as she leapt.
5 seconds.
That's all she needed. Just 5 seconds. Era felt her legs tremble with every impact against the scarlet-spattered ground. Coughed wet and desperate past the blood that slowly filled her lungs.
5 seconds.
Panicked shouts, scattered gunfire, more pain, sharp and needling in her back, but she pushed through, forced her body into movement, and ignored how she tore and twisted at the open wounds. She stumbled when a knife found her shoulder, but continued running with a red-stained grin. Time's up. All at once, it was blinding light and deafening noise, the walls trembling with a thunderous cacophony that rebounded and redoubled in the small space. Shouts joined the whirling pandemonium of 6 stun grenades all bursting at the same time. Along with bullets echoing through the alleyways and the rush of blood in her own ears. Era only realized she'd even fallen when she felt the scrape of asphalt against her cheek. More bullets in her back, ripping through her arm, a knife in her shoulder, whose pulsing heat meant it could only belong to Basilisk. Era pushed herself to her feet and found that she could stand. She lifted one trembling leg, sank her weight back down upon it, and found that she could walk. She breathed, felt the cool night air swell against her blood-soaked lungs and sting across her bullet-riddled flesh, felt her vision narrow to the step just beyond her next one, the immediate and the necessary. Tucked the pain in a dozen tight-capped boxes and gritted her teeth into a frenzied smile. Era ran. The hunters, ragged, but recovering shortly after, followed. Unfortunately, They had the slight advantage of not being filled with lead. Pity that. She dragged her body into the familiar motions of ducking, darting, weaving through the darkened city as the sounds of her pursuers grew ever nearer, gunshots ruffling her hair with how close they passed. Where was she even going? Back to the apartment? That seemed to be where her feet were leading her, but she couldn't go back there, could she? That would be selfish, spiteful cowardice, the kind of vicious narcissism that got others killed. Past the haze of blood loss and the blistering agony swirling spots across her vision with every step, she knew that. But there was no other option, was there?
You are not worth saving.
Fuck. She didn't want to lose this. She couldn't lose this. Couldn't go back to walls closing in when she hadn't even gotten used to the starlight in her hair, and the wind across her skin, and the way people would brush against her now. Place a hand on her head or her shoulder as if it meant nothing. As if they needed nothing. Required nothing, expected nothing. Another bullet nicked her shoulder, and Era stumbled as the poison pulsed within her system. Vicious necrosis seeping through her veins, and only spurred by the painful patter of her heart. She was going to lose it. All of it.
There! That's her!
Another voice joined their desperate chase as she burst out onto a main street, and for a moment, Era felt sick at the thought of reinforcement here to aid her pursuers. But, blinking past the blood haze, she saw the distinct outline of uniformed officers, as well as... Was that Zephyr? He'd brought backup. It was... sort of too little too late. But fuck, at least it was something. Era didn't stop running. She wasn't sure if she could at this point, or if the only thing keeping her upright was spite and the ceaseless motion of her body. People were shouting, though the who was unclear and irrelevant. She dodged another bullet, vaulted the hood of a parked car, ducked into a side street across the way, and vanished in the shadows. No one followed her. She was sure of it. Even so, she was constantly checking over her shoulder the entire trip back, tracking a winding route through alleyways and condemned buildings, doubling back several times over before she felt confident enough that she'd lost them. And still, the hairs on the back of her neck stood upright. Still, she jumped at every rat rummaging through the garbage, every drunk who stumbled down the sidewalk. When at last she made it back to the apartment, she felt woozy with poison and blood loss. The wounds weren't stitching together as quick as she'd have liked, and the taste of copper was thick in her throat. Still, she managed to clumsily drag herself up the fire escape and painfully trace her steps back to the windowsill, gently lifting the window up and tumbling into the dark room with a muffled hiss. The lights turned on, and she blinked in the sudden brightness, staring up at Hitoshi, where he sat upright on his bed, arms crossed. "I knew it. I knew you were sneaking out. Why didn't you... Holy shit! What the fuck happened to you?" End of chapter 50.